Hi, and welcome back to EAV 300, Virtues in the Public Square. Today, we're talking about the virtue of temperance. This, sort of like courage, and again, as you'll see, really kind of like with all the virtues, seems to be a virtue which the other virtues cannot exist without. And that's because temperance means hitting the moderate mark, the middle path. And as you'll note, and as you'll remember, all virtues by definition are the middle path between two extreme vices on either extreme, either falling short or going to excess. And so in that sense, without temperance, really no virtue can be achieved. And so that's an interesting observation, and how and all of the virtues actually, in some way or another, are essential to the realizations of the others. And so that's one of the things that you'll hear explored. Another interesting thing about this virtue is that it's not immediately obvious how temperance is connected to the idea of public good and public harmony, and so that's one of the things that you'll hear our scholars draw out, the connection between something that is typically seen as really centered on self-control, how that plays out, and its implications for broader society. One other thing I want to mention about temperance is that much like the word prudence and its connection to practical wisdom in classical usages of the word, and the way that the word has changed in its meaning in English in our common period, temperance also, the use of temperance also requires a little bit of a change in the way that you think about this term, because temperance, if it's used at all, really, in our modern context, typically is used to refer to the temperance movement in the United States, which was really solely focused on, or at least is solely associated with alcohol. And it was the temperance movement that led to the banning of the constitutional amendment banning the sale and production of alcohol in the United States in the 20s. So here, obviously, when we're saying we're using the word temperance, we're using it in a different way. We're using it in a way that means really moderation. We use this term temperance because that's the way that it was classically used, and so it becomes part of our sort of terminology of virtue ethics. And so I'd like you to keep that in mind as you listen. We're going to go ahead and hear Professor Yonatan Brafman discuss temperance in Judaism. We're going to hear Matthew Levering discuss temperance in Christianity. And Professor Walead Mosaad, Imam Walead Mosaad, will talk about temperance in Islam. And again, all three of them are going to really be focusing in their presentations on the way that this very intensely private and personal quality ends up having a lot of interesting implications for society at large and our relations with other human beings. Thank you, and I'll look forward to seeing you after you've watched the videos.
Jewish thought is a dialogue between the Hebrew Bible, as interpreted by the rabbinic sages, and philosophy, as articulated in its various languages, including Greek, Arabic, Latin, German, and English. This is true of ethics in general, as well as the virtue of temperance. What I want to suggest in the next few minutes is that in reflecting on temperance, Judaism also offers a compelling vision of the relation between public good and private perfection. According to Aristotle, temperance is having the appropriate desires relating to the sense of touch, and so including those for sex, drink, and food. The standard of appropriate desire is specified by the doctrine of the mean. Excess desire is self-indulgence, and deficiency in desire is insensibility. This does not mean splitting the difference between given extremes, however. The extremes are determined by the mean, which is constituted by human nature and its telos. Several sets of questions must therefore be answered when discussing Judaism's view of temperance. First are practical ones. What should be desired and how much? And is the goal simply continence to control one's desires, one's actions, whatever one desires, or temperance, to have the right desires themselves? As such, it raises the issue of the value of asceticism, that is, restraining one's desires. Second are theoretical questions. What's the standard by which this relation to desires is determined? What are human nature and its telos? Third are political questions. How can the laws of a polity attend to both the ordinary limitations of human nature and the extraordinary achievements of its telos? The Jewish tradition characteristically answers these questions not through abstract theorizing, but through analysis of law, or halakha. In this case, they're answered by the medieval philosopher and jurisprudent Moses Maimonides by reflecting on the laws of the Nazarite, an individual who takes a vow of abstinence. Maimonides understands Judaism as attentive to human nature and its desires, as they are and will likely always be for most people, while also providing directions for those who may attain the human telos by transforming their desires. Further, this discussion is situated in an account of various types of law, including divine law, the commandments, as well as human law. While the Nazarite is introduced in the written Torah in the book of Numbers, it is employed in the oral Torah or rabbinic literature as a point of reflection on bodily desires. The Nazarite undertakes a vow to refrain from drinking wine, cutting his hair, and rendering himself impure for some time period. At the end of that period, or if he's accidentally rendered impure, he or she must bring sacrifices, including a sin offering. Why a sin offering? The Talmud discusses this question in the context of the general appropriateness of undertaking voluntary fasts. According to one opinion, a Nazarite must bring a sin offering because he has sinned against himself by abstaining from wine. So too, it's argued, anyone who abstains from permitted food or drink has sinned. Yet the Talmud also records another view, as is its way. Only a Nazarite who violates his oath by becoming impure is sinful. One who fulfills his oath is praiseworthy. Elsewhere, the distinction between the sinful and praiseworthy Nazarite is associated, not with whether he fulfills the vow, but with his intention in making it. A sinful Nazarite vows frivolously, whereas a praiseworthy one is an individual who, tempted to glory in his physical body, dedicates it to God. Maimonides articulates his position on the Nazarite in the context of these three Talmudic positions and against the background of his own virtue ethics, jurisprudence, and political theory. Maimonides' ethics is influenced by Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, though with certain deviations. In Maimonides' introduction to Tractate Avot, he maintains that moderate virtues like temperance, as well as the extreme vices like self-indulgence and insensibility, are inculcated through repeated actions which form habits. Yet they're also influenced by a person's unique predispositions and social environment, which often encourage the extreme of excess. Thus, individuals might engage in therapeutic deviations from the virtuous mean, inclining an action towards the extreme of deficiency, to avoid becoming mired in the extreme of excess. They would refrain, for example, from fulfilling their desires for food, drink, and sex. Maimonides insists, however, that such therapeutic deviations towards asceticism are only necessary in the absence of the perfect law, the divine Torah. This is because the Torah's commandments inculcate the moderate virtues and uproot the vicious extremes. They occasionally do this by inclining towards the extreme of deficiency, especially when it comes to the desires for food, drink, and sex. Since this correction for the tendency towards excess is already incorporated or built in within the commandments, personal therapeutic deviations like those of the Nazarite are discouraged. The Nazarite's renunciations go beyond those mandated by the Torah towards ascetic self-denial and will result in vicious insensibility. Maimonides appears here to advocate temperance as an ethical ideal. One should desire food, drink, and sex in moderation, and should not engage in ascetic self-denial like the Nazarite. This position is repeated in the Laws of Traits of the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides' great legal code, as is his condemnation of the Nazarite. The commandments of the Torah are sufficient to achieve the moderate virtues, including temperance, which Maimonides claims fulfills the commandment to walk in God's ways. Yet Maimonides takes a different position when he codifies the Nazarite's laws elsewhere in the Mishneh Torah. There he writes, quote, "One who vows to God in a holy manner, this is pleasing and praiseworthy. The written Torah equates him to a prophet, as it is written, Scripture, and I will raise up from among your sons as prophets and some of your young men as Nazarenes," end quote. Not all Nazarites are sinners, according to this view, since they deny their desire for wine. Rather, only those who vow in a frivolous manner. An individual who vows to become a Nazarite in holiness, so further the desire for God is to be praised. Indeed, he's equivalent to a prophet. Maimonides' complex view on temperance must therefore be understood in the context of his account of prophecy. In the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides claims, first, that prophecy is the human telos, goal of all human beings. Second, prophecy requires the denial of bodily desires for food, drink, and sex. The prophet leaves behind his commonality with animals, the sense of touch and its desires, and pursues the actualization of his rational capacity. The human telos for Maimonides includes not temperate desires for drink, food, and sex, but their extinction. They're to be replaced with the desire to attain apprehension of God. The relationship of the Nazarite and the prophet, respectively, to their desires for drink, food, and sex, can be described in terms of continence and temperance. The Nazarite possesses those desires, but restrains them. His vow is meant to reinforce continence. The prophet has already extinguished those bodily desires, and so no longer needs to restrain them. His desire is for apprehension of God, and so, relative to that desire, he's temperate. Of course, such temperance differs greatly from the common temperance, which is inculcated by most of the commandments of the divine law. Maimonides maintains that those commandments aim at both the welfare of the body and the welfare of the soul. The welfare of the body is promoted by laws that prevent injustice and promote justice, as well as cultivate the moral qualities necessary for common human life. The welfare of the soul consists in the members of society perfecting their rational capacities to the extent possible. Divine law uniquely allows human beings to attain both the perfection of the body and the perfection of the soul. The perfection of the body can only be achieved within a polity, and so requires laws that prevent injustice, promote justice, as well as cultivate moral virtues. The perfection of the soul is, again, apprehension of God. The welfare of the body is necessary, but not sufficient for the welfare of the soul. A just polity whose members have acquired socially beneficial moral quality provides the framework within which individuals can acquire correct beliefs. Similarly, the perfection of the body is a prerequisite for the perfection of the soul. But the perfection of the soul is distinct from it. Indeed, insofar as the perfection of the body concerns the body, it must be transcended to achieve the perfection of the soul. Indeed, Maimonides maintains that, quote, abandonment, depreciation, and restraint of desires, food, drink, and sex, belongs to the totality of the purposes of the perfect law, end quote. Divine law thus pursues two different goals: the moderation of those desires and their extinction. This corresponds to Maimonides' differing evaluations of the Nazarite. In fact, Maimonides describes God as having, quote, employed a gracious ruse, end quote, in relation to these desires. Because most humans cannot abide the sudden shift from satisfying bodily desire to pursuing apprehension of God, temperance is prescribed. Still, the ideal remains its transcendence. Maimonides acknowledges that the commandments are focused on the common person who will not attain that ideal. He writes, quote, law was not given with a view to things that are rare, end quote. And this includes the capacity to achieve the human telos. Most commandments encourage temperance while correcting for the tendency for self-indulgence by only inclining towards insensibility. Only some individuals move from temperate to continent bodily desires and eventually on to their extinction and replacement with the desire for apprehension of God. The first goal corresponds to Maimonides' depreciation of the Nazarite for deviating from the mean. The second to Maimonides' exaltation of the Nazarite, and the last to the vision of prophecy. The Nazarite, however, is an institution that's unique to divine law. It signals the commandment's capacity to enable individuals to attain the human telos. This does not mean, however, that Maimonides thinks that human law is unconcerned with the virtues. Divine law and human law share their concern with the welfare of the body, which includes preventing injustice, promoting justice, as well as inculcating virtue. Divine law is distinguished from human law solely through its ability to allow the perfection of the soul. For Maimonides, then, the norms of human law, like most of the commandments, should foster temperate desires for food, drink, and sex, without ascetic self-denial or the transformation of bodily desires to the desire for apprehension of God. Moderating human desires for food, drink, and sex in view of human nature to inculcate the virtue of temperance is the mark of what is shared by good human law and perfect divine law. Yet such temperance, moderate desire for food, drink, and sex, is neither the human telos nor the path to it. The path to the human telos leads from ascetic self-denial to the transcendence of bodily desires in favor of apprehension of God. It also remains, even under divine law, a path walked only by the individual. Divine law is perfect, not because it enforces the human telos. Rather, it is perfect because it both secures the public good, which includes fostering temperate bodily desires, and because it enables the achievement of the human telos, which requires their private transcendence. Thank you very much.
Remarks, I will sketch why Christians hold that temperance is required for the common good to be pursued and attained. Christians hold that God created humans and that humans are recognizably one species, that is, humans share nature. Appeals to human nature maintain that humans share certain bodily and rational powers that pertain to our flourishing as rational animals. For example, human nature includes the fact that in this earthly life we need food to flourish, but obsession with food can damage human flourishing. Likewise with sex. Sex serves the flourishing of the spouses by enabling procreation of children and strengthening the marital bond. And in this way, sex has its place in the flourishing of families and of societies. But sexual desire can be gratified in various ways that undermine the flourishing of men and women, families, and societies. And as, for example, when pornography addiction or pornography use or adultery breaks up marriages, or when women or children are used for sexual gratification. From this perspective, we can begin to appreciate the importance of the virtue of temperance for the common good. Temperance in food and sex enables us to flourish individually and communally. Rational reflection enables us to perceive that the place that we give to eating and sex has implications for human happiness. Christians believe, however, that given our fallenness, we need grace, divine healing, and elevation in order to be temperate in a manner that will conduce both to our earthly and our eternal happiness. During our lives, we may find ourselves needing repeatedly to start over, asking anew for God's grace. I'll begin with temperate desire for food. I'm just going to give an overview here of temperate desire for food and temperate sexuality. Persons who eat only a little are not necessarily temperate. In fact, they may not be eating enough for the sustenance of their body in order to do the work that God calls them to do. Temperate eating is not measured by whether one is thin or fat. Temperate eating is not about health, which, as Aquinas observes, belongs to the medical domain rather than to the domain of virtues. What then makes for a temperate relation to food? The answer is that a temperate person eats so as to sustain bodily life with the goal of serving God and neighbor. Food is a wonderful good, but it is always an instrumental good, not something to which we can virtuously subordinate the good of other persons or the good of knowing and loving God. The temperate eater must therefore keep the common good in view, though the virtuous person will generally do this unconsciously rather than simply eating to gratify himself or herself. For example, a temperate eater will wish to build up familial and friendship bonds and to welcome the stranger as God commands through sharing good meals together. A temperate eater will take time to enjoy meals with family and friends. Preparation of a good meal and enjoyment of a good meal are often among the richest ways of interacting with family and friends and strengthening those communal bonds. Welcoming strangers by inviting them to meals is a sign of temperate eating. In addition to building up familial and friendship bonds and welcoming the stranger, temperate eating will involve considering the ramifications of our eating upon others in a broad range of ways. One can be gluttonous, says Thomas Aquinas, if one becomes dainty in one's eating, so that one becomes very hard to please. To please one's palate, one may spend a great deal of money on the finest things, the finest foods, while one's neighbors go hungry. It's one thing if one prepares and enjoys a fine meal as part of building up familial and friendship bonds and serving the Lord. But it's another thing if one self-centeredly eats well while others are doing without. Similarly, ecological ramifications of how we eat need attention, as does the just treatment of animals. Okay, now a brief section on chastity. People will starve without food, but it is possible to live long and happily without sex, since the human need for interpersonal communion can be met in other ways. Yet, if sex had not been highly desirable, the human race would have ended shortly after it began. And if sex did not help bond the couple together as it does, then it would have been much less likely that children would be raised by both parents in a stable marriage rather than solely by the mother. When speaking about the relationship of human sexuality to the common good, we can begin with the good of children, since their well-being depends in many ways upon the sexual choices made by their parents. Contraception and premarital sex are promoted by governments in the West and elsewhere on the grounds that adult sexual expression should never be limited by fear of having a child or by unreadiness to have one. Many Western nations now consider it to be bigoted to judge homosexual acts to be immoral or to restrict marriage to being between a man and a woman. Open marriage and polyamory are viewed as acceptable in our culture, so long as the adult partners fully consent. Other than child pornography, pornography today is essentially unregulated in the West, thereby promoting a culture of masturbation. By contrast, temperate sexual desire consistently is directed to the full flourishing of the person, the family, and the society. Since every person was once a child, reflection upon temperate use of sexual desire should begin with care for children, with reflection on how a particular adult expression of sexual desire ultimately conduces or does not conduce to the flourishing of children, of families. In fornication, for example, the man and woman do not commit to each other in a public long-term way. The result is that if the act of sexual intercourse results in the procreation of a child, the child is much less likely to be raised by both of his or her parents or integrated into both parents' extended families, with very negative consequences for the child. Furthermore, if the man and woman become used to fornicating, it can easily happen that they may become used to having short-term sexual relationships rather than ever making a commitment to another person. Such expression of sexual desire does not conduce to the man's or the woman's flourishing. It definitely doesn't conduce to the flourishing of a child or children that come forth from the man and woman's relationship. Adultery, for its part, is a form of sexual expression that weakens the bond of marriage. And this is obviously detrimental to the good of children, given that children flourish best when they are raised by their father and mother in a stable family. Adultery often arises from a deep unhappiness rooted in self-centeredness, ego, or need for attention, and it generally doesn't meet the needs of the persons involved. Objectively speaking, an adulterous person acts in a self-centered and untrustworthy way, even if particular situations carry with them rationales that often may be understandable. When the woman in the gospel confesses her adultery, Jesus offers her the gift of divine mercy, joined to the command to go and do not sin again, John chapter 8. A brief conclusion, and I know much has been left unsaid here. The virtue of temperance, however, today has a bad reputation. This is particularly the case with chastity. People with, perhaps with the exception of adultery, sexual acts between consenting adults today are generally assumed to be necessarily good. But as Reinhard Hutter, my friend, a Catholic theologian, says, quote, the virtue of chastity is a principal protector of human dignity, end quote. Indeed, few things could be more important for fostering the common good than promoting and living the virtues of temperance. Thank you.
Hello. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I greet you with the greetings of Islam, and peace be upon you all. And in this short presentation, I would like to talk a little bit about the cardinal virtue of temperance as it stood from an Islamic perspective. In Arabic, we have some equivalents to these virtues that we talk about in English. And in Arabic, we refer to the word temperance mostly via the word al-iffa, which sometimes is understood as chastity, but it has a broader meaning than the greater Islamic ethos. And in order to understand temperance, I think we have to talk a little bit about the idea of virtue from an Islamic perspective to begin with. And basically the word for character or good character in Arabic comes from a word that is similar to one's outside disposition. So it's more about a paradigm of outward disposition and inward disposition. So one's outward disposition, what they look like, the mannerisms that they have, and so forth. This is referred to as al-khalq, which also is the same word as creation. So it's something that is bestowed upon one by divine decree or by God. And then that which refers to the inward disposition or the inward beauty is referred to as al-khuluq. Al-khuluq. So it's actually a difference of a vowel, a diacritical mark between the two words, whereas khuluq refers to one's inward state. And there is a very famous prophetic tradition that is narrated from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمِ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I have not been sent except to perfect beautiful character traits. So in that sense, the worth or the value of a person then is via their character and their outward disposition, their outward beauty, let's say, is an indication of the inward beauty. And so, in as much as one's inner beauty is exemplified and is enhanced, then this will also show on the outside. So obviously not in kind of the modern sense of what people do for, to enhance their outward beauty from even going to plastic surgery and things like that. No, we're talking more about kind of a shine that will come through from one's inner beauty. And this inner beauty then is something that can be sought, that can be worked towards. The Islamic theology does say that every human being is born in a state of purity, what is called to refer to as al-fitra, right, in a state of primordial purity, and then nurture, as it were, after they are born, can then lead them to deviate from that natural purity. So as a result, there has to be a bit of work and a bit of striving and struggling, sometimes referred to as suluk in Islamic ethos. And suluk means to traverse a path that is obstacle ridden. So to get to a place where that inner beauty then can reach its potential, and then it will have that outward shine. So the khuluq, then, the character traits that we are referring to, amongst the chief character traits is this trait called al-iffa, or temperance. And it is usually mentioned in conjunction with the main obstacle, one of two main obstacles that we find when we talked earlier about, just a minute ago, about suluk. So one of the two main obstacles is, or are, one's appetitive desire and one's what's called to ash-shahwaniyya, so one's appetitive desire, which refers to food, drink, and sex. And the other obstacle is that which is propelled by anger and rage, which is kind of going back to the survival instinct in all animals, including human beings. But again, if that is not tempered and is not channeled in a positive way, let's say towards courage, in the Aristotelian schema, character traits are a happy medium between two extremes. So courage would be the ideal between rage and between cowardice. And many Muslim theologians and ethicists also adopted this schema. Amongst them, the famous theologian Abu Hamid al-Ghazali adopted this, and others before him, including Avicenna or Ibn Sina, based upon the Aristotelian topography of having a medium between two extremes. That being said, however, the positive character traits, as we mentioned, specifically temperance, then is seen as the manner by which we can put these appetitive and, let's call them attribute of rage, within check, so they are channeled in the proper way. So usually temperance or iffa or chastity is referring to the more appetitive sense rather than the anger sense. And in this sense, in Islam, it's food and drink are not shameful, nor sexual intercourse, and it's something that Muslims are even encouraged to participate in. In the Muslim tradition, celibacy is not a virtue. No one is encouraged towards celibacy. The Prophet Muhammad himself had multiple wives. So that has never been kind of part of the understanding of the virtue of temperance or of iffa, but rather to channel it in the proper way. And generally speaking, this is going to be a focus more on an inward state than the outward state. So in terms of practice, yes, there are certain dietary restrictions within Islam. The act of, or the sexual union is seen as something that should be also within a committed relationship that we would call zawaj, or marriage, that is between a man and a woman, and that is a covenant first and foremost with God. It's described in the Quran as mithaq ghalidh, or as a heavy covenant. So because there are so many repercussions and circumstances that can come about because of a sexual union, and not the least of which are children, then there has to be understood to be a committed relationship, not only for the preservation of the two zawj, or the two partners in the relationship, but also any children that may come about as a result of sexual union, and also society in general, and the community in general. So there are many things, I think, within the teachings of Islam that are looking towards not just the preservation and survival of community, but also the thriving of community. And so temperance on a basic individual level is very important, and then it brings forth also importance on a communal level. So to kind of keep one's appetites in check via the virtue of temperance or of al-iffa is seen as an overarching cardinal virtue, from which spring forth other virtues, perhaps like sabr, or patience, forbearance. So to be patient, to be forbearant with one's own desires, with one's own, let's say, inability to resist temptation. So we have a very, I would say, robust system and understanding of forgiveness and of redemption, and that no human being is beyond redemption until they take their last breath and then they pass on to the next life. And so no matter how many times one may fall into iniquity or into sin or into undesirable behavior or even thoughts, there's always that opportunity for one to redress that situation via the Islamic concept and principle of what's called tawbah, sometimes referred to or translated as repentance, but perhaps a better translation would be turning towards God or turning back towards God. So there's an indication that when one commits a sin, there is a kind of a veering away somewhat. In the moment that one is committing the sin, it's as if the greater virtues and the acknowledgement of God as all-seeing and all-knowing temporarily is lifted from kind of the spiritual psyche of the believer, of the aspirant at the time. But then they may return to that via this instrument or via this ethos that we call tawbah, or returning back to God. So, in a sense, temperance then is understanding these concepts and then improving the inward state so that the outward state also will be less apt to fall into these mistakes. So it's kind of looking towards self-discipline, a mastery of one's own self, or modern parlance, self-management. So self-management of one's desires, of one's appetites. Hence, we also have practical things also that are kind of spiritual instruments by which one can be or embody the state of temperance, namely fasting, for example. So Muslims fast the month of Ramadan every year, which is the 9th month of the lunar calendar, for a month in total between the hours of dawn to sunset. And this is considered to be like a spiritual training in the sense that if one can avoid what is normally permissible during the day, then this will kind of fortify one in the months that come after Ramadan, so that they may also be able to discipline themselves and resist and refrain from these things that would lead them to iniquity and to difficult situations. So as a result, we say that temperance or iffa is one of the most important virtues, and there are specifically different methods and means, often associated with kind of a disciplinary branch of Islam, not a sect, but a disciplinary branch. In other words, it came out of a particular intellectual discipline, and this is often referred to as tasawwuf or Sufism. So the Sufis in general have certain methods and means by which one can embody oneself with temperance. So like we said, there are periods of fasting. There are also something called seclusion or khalwa, which is to seclude oneself from kind of one's normal routine and one's normal happenings and goings of relationships in order to cultivate within oneself a greater fortitude to resist temptation. So khalawat, fasting, they also refer to a samt, which is to select to be silent, not to be silent because of lack of ability, but to select to be silent. We live in a cultural paradigm where one is seen not to be really doing anything positive unless they are active and they are saying something or they're doing something. But the ancients and the masters of the spiritual traditions before us often elected silence as a means by which to cultivate within oneself this serenity and tranquility and ability then to know when to be active and know when to be silent. So kind of like a silencing of the heart in order for then the heart to be illuminated and then to inspire the body to act in the proper way that it should, depending upon the situation and depending upon the circumstance. So seclusion, samt, which is to choose to be silent. And the great Sufi theologian Ibn Arabi talked about these things. In particular, he talked also about um, night vigilance, right? So, which is kind of to put off one's sleep, again, in order to enliven the heart. And perhaps, we can conclude that all of these are under the prophetic rubric and understanding of the prophetic tradition. Verily, there is a morsel of flesh within the body. If it is rectified, the whole body is rectified. And if it is corrupted, the whole body is corrupted, and that is the heart. And here this is referring to the spiritual heart. So all of the virtues, and amongst them temperance, then, are seen as states of the heart that then can be cultivated and can be practiced via outward practical things like fasting, like praying, like supplication. But it also requires sort of meditative contemplation and requires restraint on the part of the aspirant. And these are some of the things that we understood from the Islamic tradition. And obviously, we have more time. There's a lot more that we can say. But in interest of time, I'm going to conclude here. And I hope that this was of some benefit for those who are listening to it. And we look forward to future programs with you all. And we leave you with the greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
Thank you all for joining me, and thank you for your, beautiful presentations and papers that you submitted that the students are using as part of the course content here. I wanted to ask each of you, and really anyone who likes can lead off with this, but I wanted to ask, how is temperance related to the aims of human existence? And I'm thinking specifically happiness in this life and happiness in the next life, and to know and be in relationship with God. For example, Aquinas discussed that the ultimate aim of happiness was to know God and be in relationship with God. And certainly there's something quite similar in what Maimonides discussed, and as well what Imam al-Ghazali and other Islamic scholars talked about in terms of knowing God, closeness to God, and then ultimately in the hereafter, seeing him, meeting him. How does temperance relate to that?
If I can lead off.
Yes.
So,
Sheikh Walead, please.
Knowing God is kind of, I think, also akin to knowing reality, right? Because the Muslim ethos is, and I think other religions as well, obviously, consider God to be the ultimate reality, the inescapable reality. And there are kind of breadcrumbs, let's call them, that God puts in creation for us to realize that ultimate reality. And there's a popular saying, sometimes attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, but not always, that says, "Whoever knows themselves knows God." And
whoever knows what? You broke up.
If you know yourself, you know God. So knowing yourself is a key to knowing God. And the theologians kind of looked at that from two aspects, from the point of transcendence and the point of immanence. So in the sense that you are nothing like God, and he has these inimitable attributes that no one can take on from one perspective. So kind of and the Quran uses language sometimes that indicates that God is far away. It uses the pronoun that is applied with distance, like dhalika and things like that in Arabic. And sometimes it refers to the immanence of God. Right, and he is closer to you than the carotid artery, or closer to you than the jugular vein. So in the sense, which is a tradition, I think, in all three Abrahamic religions, that man has been created in the image of God, which is also a Muslim tradition. So there are also attributes that are God-like. And via those immanent attributes of seeing, of hearing, and of course of knowing, knowledge being the highest, then one can also know God. So from one aspect, you know God from knowing that he is completely antithetical to your, let's say, your corporal aspect. And at the same time, there's a similarity or a similitude to your more spiritual aspect. And so if the human being doesn't know himself from both of those aspects, So to know the distance aspect between you and God in terms of your physicalities, which God has none, and to know God from the immanent aspects, from your spiritual attributes. And so hence all of the virtue ethics or the attributes then are tied to this immanent spirituality. And so if you embody those attributes, then you know God, and then this leads to both felicity or happiness, both in this life as well as the next.
So how does, we'll definitely want to hear from our other two panelists, but I just wanted to ask, how does Ifa, or the Arabic term for temperance, or its related concepts like sabr, patience, and so on, shyness, meekness, how do those things get us to that point? What's the
I think
relationship?
temperance is interesting because you can see it as in Arabic we would say the barzakh, or the zone between transcendence and immanence, I would say. So from on the one aspect, we have our kind of physical attributes and animalistic attributes, and we crave and we have hunger and we have appetitive attributes, and we love and we hate, and things that are connected to our physicalities that show us the transcendence of God, because God is nothing like that. But when we temper those attributes, hence temperance, and then we are connected with our spiritual side, of mercy, of compassion, of the God-like attributes. The Quran says, "Be God-like," from that which you have studied from the book. In other words, from the Quran. So temperance is kind of the crossover. You cross the Rubicon, you get to the other side of temperance, then you get to let's say a more potent and impactful spirituality. But if you're on the left side of temperance, let's call it, or the side of appetite and the side of hunger and desire and carnal desires, and not tempering those particular desires, then you're left out kind of in the no man's land of just purely human attributes and not being in tune with the more godlike attributes.
So Yonatan, and I actually don't know which of the two, Yonatan or Matthew, are better to ask this, but maybe both of you can weigh in, and of course, or ignore what I say and respond to anything that you might have heard Dr. Walead saying. But what it seems to me like from what Sheikh Walead is saying is that, in fact, because virtues are between two vices, isn't temperance sort of like almost in a certain way the essence of virtue, because it's without it you can't find that any other virtue between two vices? Am I right in understanding that?
So, I mean, I can go. I would say that you're right. There are two things that you're saying, right? Temperance can either be of a presupposition of other virtues, or it can be the essence of virtues, right? And what I would want to say is, in Judaism, at least as theorized by Maimonides, it's certainly the presupposition of other virtues, but it's not the essence of virtue. And this is because this virtue really functions on two levels. Jewish accounts of the virtues, according to Maimonides, always have two ends in view. Right? The kind of the ordinary person in view of human nature, and the achievement of the human telos. And so temperance, specifically in terms of having the right desires, in terms of moderate desires, in terms of things like sex, food, and drink, Maimonides does say that you should aim for some sort of temperate mean. However, the person who's striving for excellence, which is to say achieving human telos, and Maimonides thinks this will only be for individuals, should aim to transcend temperance, and in fact go in a direction towards asceticism and the transformation of one's desires from having bodily desires to having intellectual desires. So at that higher level of the human telos, it would be wrong to say that temperance is the essence of virtue, right? Because the goal here is to transcend all of those desires. But it's certainly a predisposition in the sense that it's a presupposition in the sense that one first needs to attain temperate desires and then ultimately move in the direction of asceticism and the transformation of these bodily desires towards higher desires.
So we heard about from from Sheikh Walead, we heard about the relationship of temperance and virtue in general to God, to knowing God, to achieving happiness through meeting Him, through knowing Him. But and Dr. Brafman touched on that too. What is the relationship, though, between temperance and, if you like, virtue in general, and the common good? So, in other words, the really interesting thing about virtue, looking at character from the point of view of the virtue sort of schema, is that there's this sort of dual notion of the telos, of the goal of happiness in the hereafter through knowing God for the individual, happiness in this life through, not to put words in anyone's mouth, but through presumably ordering the soul and the happiness that comes through that balance, because God intended for the human being to be a certain way. This is sort of the humanness, of achieving the full sort of, or at least working towards achieving the full potential of what the human being is supposed to be. But there's also a sense in which the virtues, and in our case temperance, lead to the good of all. So could you elaborate a little bit on how temperance, first of all, it to me it's interesting, what is the relationship between the common good, knowing God, and knowing God, because it's not perhaps an obvious connection. And then how does temperance work to do that?
Well, thank you. Well, at least from a Christian perspective, God is the ultimate common good. So that means that, God is the good that we all are created to share. And God is common good because, God is for all of us, and that God doesn't run out, as it were. That's another point. But now, in terms of your question, I would go back. Let me just give a brief little summary of how Christian would think about this. On the one hand, we would think of the common good as essentially ultimately the kingdom of God. And so the kingdom of God then is shared in through self-sacrificial love. So the question is, how can you live in a way that orders your own person and your family and your community, toward self-sacrificial love? And so then once that is understood, then it's going to become evident that there's certain behaviors that point away, both personally and in terms of your community, from a communal and personal life that's caught up in self-sacrificial love. So, and then you get into, what is temperance, and then what are the vices against temperance? So here the main thing would be, we can think of temperance. Aquinas associates certain virtues with temperance, but strictly speaking, temperance has to do, this is from the classical tradition, strictly speaking, temperance has to do with food and sexual intercourse, or sexual desire. But Aquinas associates some virtues with temperance, and I think the most important one is the virtue of humility, which means humility here is just a right understanding of one's creatureliness, and so there you can see that pride is the fundamental danger. Pride is essentially a self-love rather than love of God. You see a self-love over God and certainly over neighbor. So pride is kind of the worst that you can do. And then as a community that is caught up, or a political community that's caught up in pride, you can see such a community would be leading its members away from union with God, because it would be caught up in its own self, in its own greatness. And so you can see it insofar as pride is a vice against temperance, and Aquinas thinks it is, but temperance in a broad sense here. then you can really see how intemperance, or the sins against temperance, are connected with destroying the common good, because obviously pride leads away from God. But then I want to mention also that St. Paul and others within the Christian tradition have also just kind of said, look, you cannot be part of the kingdom of God if you are engaging in debauchery. If your life is just about your belly, about yourself and feeding yourself and your own pleasures, that kind of thing. So, and certainly if you're engaged in sexual acts that do not build up the self-sacrificial love of the community, do not build up family, are not properly related to care for the weak, care for children, then you're in a situation where you're moving away from the common good, and your intemperance then is destroying. You're not going to be part of the kingdom of God. You're acting against the kingdom of God for the common good. So, okay, that's a long answer to a very beautiful question.
That was in fact, I was listening to you and I began thinking that almost every sentence you said could be the beginning of another essay. I wondered, one thing out of the millions of things that could be said about this is that this almost strikes me as the precise opposite of the notion of the good that seems to be competing with this classical tradition, which is the good meaning maximizing individual autonomy. It's almost as if that notion of the good is at war with with the notion of the common good, which the classical tradition supports. And it's almost difficult to see how. I mean, it seems as though even the Supreme Court has signed on to this notion of maximization of individual autonomy as the essence of liberty, which is in fact quite the opposite of what the founders had thought. And it's hard to imagine what a society would look like taken to that logical conclusion. That's just my comment. Does anyone?
Yeah, but let me throw in a point on that. That's a very brief point on that.
Yeah.
Which is that, at least from a Christian perspective, and that would be the case that maximizing human freedom is not an evil thing. The problem, though, is that sin and vice are slavery to subhuman life. So in other words, that essentially what's happening is, and you can have a whole society that imagines that autonomy means essentially imagines that some sort of freedom really is about freedom to pursue the vices. But when you have that's a slavery. That's a slavery to sin, and that so that's not real freedom. So freedom really is. Freedom then is to be a human person, and that is to be able to really love each other, and that's freedom. So we want as much freedom as we can, but freedom freedom means loving. It doesn't mean becoming enslaved to vices that drag us all down.
Amazing.
I mean, just to chime in on this, one of the common kind of denominators here, right, is a conception of freedom in terms of realizing what you are, right? Your nature and your telos, right? Not kind of libertarian freedom, right? Which is kind of freedom to do as one wills, right? So Maimonides too, in various actually legal contexts, talks about that there are certain times in which there are kind of nudges or even kind of frameworks that are set up by Jewish law, right? That seem to inhibit people's freedom, we would think, kind of from a 21st century perspective. But he actually argues are conducive to human freedom, because human freedom, right, is realizing who you truly are, kind of your right desires, rather than, as was just pointed out, kind of what could be kind of enslaving intrusions onto your full realization.
Sheikh Walead, both of what both Dr. Brafman and Dr. Levering said certainly resonates with much of what I as a layperson, have studied about Islam. Can you think of anything that might reflect or be similar to what you're saying in terms of Islam's teachings?
Well, I think our perspective largely echoes what they both said, and perhaps, I could put it in a way that sounds a little bit radical, but I would say that true freedom is to be free from this notion of freedom to begin with. There's a intellectual genealogy that we don't have time to go into about this idea of freedom and liberty and so forth, that has a lot to do with sometimes religious tyranny and sometimes with abuses of religious institutions. But I think it also has a lot to do with, as was mentioned, that people conflate the notion of freedom to do what one wills and what one wants with the idea of freedom in the sense of realizing one's true telos or purpose in life. And so there's been a divorce, I think, between that notion that the idea of a purposeful, ethical life is the epitome of happiness and realization of liberty, and that one's lowest common denominator and carnal and appetitive desires often get in the way of that. And as we mentioned earlier, temperance is kind of the hedge virtue that protects one or allows one, let's say, to delve into the realm of a higher spiritual realization and true realization of one's purpose. And some of the Muslim mystics, they said to be truly free is to be free from wanting, right? Which is what I was trying to get to not to want anything. Because if you're wanting of things, that means you could be a slave to those things, as was mentioned by Matthew. So, and we find that that's really true. If you're not a true servant of God, then you're going to wind up being a servant to something else. And the principle states that if you're not a servant to something pure and wholesome and good and beautiful, then invariably you're going to be a slave to something that is ugly and poisonous and destructive. And the point that was mentioned earlier about the link between the common good and the notion of good that we have now. And we just look at the politically fraught environment, let's say in the United States, that we have today on issues of abortion and gun safety or gun control, or whatever that people want to say it. And you often find, I think, what has happened now, it's not so much about the issues anymore. And there is no true discussion of the issues. It's more sort of like a tribal fight. And to me, that's an indication that we've kind of descended into the lower realms and depths, unfortunately, of our humanity, when we don't even have the ability to actually look at things as they really are. So in our blinded pursuit of what we denote to be freedom, in essence, we've become slaves to the notion of freedom, right? So, people on either side of either issue, usually the argument is, well, I should be free to do this, or I should be free to do that, without considering that society, from a particular perspective, operates as one organism. So it's an illusion to think that you can have this individual autonomy and freedom in a way that will not affect those around you and affect the greater environment, and not have a damaging and often malevolent effect on others. And we as theists, we see that creation is purposeful, and that the interdependencies that we see that are quite evident also is purposeful. We're social beings. We weren't created to live alone. We can't cater for all of our needs, both physical and otherwise, as individuals. It's not possible. You actually need a society. You need a community. You need people who are doing and fulfilling various roles in order to happen that. And even the question of gender today, also it comes into that discussion, that the idea that this is a purposeful creation, that there is a rhyme and reason behind why things are the way that they are. And so our notion of freedom has gone to the extent that we even begin to challenge what we thought would be kind of the anchors of what we think is our common existence. And I think, as Heidegger said, that he said the ethos of modernity or postmodernism is to be thyself, right? Be as you want to be. Whereas the notion of traditional societies or pre-modernity is know thyself, right? As Yonatan was referring to. So it's not about the freedom to do as you want, but the freedom to know yourself and to be given the opportunity to really know reality as it is. And no one talks about that particular freedom, which I think is often lost in the conversation. So,
I think that's good. And then also, from a Christian perspective, there was a very strong critique of the pagans, that's present in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Now the pagans had wisdom, people like Aristotle or Aristotle and Plato and whatever. But there's also a very strong critique of their way of life, and to some degree, the Christian perspective would be that we've all been, humans does have a tendency to go to the bad, in a way, but there's also a beautiful thing that we see in our culture right now, which is that speaking of intemperance, think of the Me Too movement, although the Me Too movement can be distorted. But and then also think about the campus culture, because when I was teaching at the University of Dayton, for example, this was 2009 to 2013. This was a supposedly Catholic college, but 25% of the women during their 4 years there, 25% at least, reported internally within the university experiencing a sexual assault. And so the point is that they didn't like it. In other words, and I think that's a lot of the things we see in the campus culture and the Me Too movement. These things are coming because temperance is evil. Temperance causes pain. Intemperance. Intemperance. Apologies. Intemperance causes pain for people, and fornication causes pain for people, and it causes pain for children who don't know their fathers. These are very simple things, really, that we see in our culture, where sins against temperance, such as fornication or whatnot, also pornography. Think of pornography, the tremendous costs that are being borne in terms of relationships. And so I feel that at least this is a good thing about our human nature, is that the sins against temperance cause pain, and that reminds us that we gotta repent and live. Hopefully, maybe our culture, at least those of us who are Jews, Christians, Muslims, can live in a better way.
I was just talking to my sister-in-law, who's a nurse, and she was telling me that she works in a mother-child unit at the hospital, and was telling me that they, in the city that we live in, they have frequent children that they have to detox from drugs. They're born addicted, and so not only do you have a problem of intemperance with the fornication that leads, and not in many cases, to the birth of a child, and we have to thank God that the child was born and not aborted, as common in our country, but then being born with addicted to drugs, how, and you think, how could someone be so self-centered, as to do that. I was just listening to a interview with David Foster Wallace. That's his name, David Wallace Foster, or David Foster Wallace. I'm not a huge student of contemporary literature, but anyway, he was saying that the term, and I don't know how accurate this was, but he was saying that the Latin term for addiction actually comes from a word that originally means worship, and he said that it was a term that was originally used for monks. And he was saying that, precisely what I think someone here said was that we all have a innate nature of worship. And the question is just, what are we going to worship? Which leads me to ask, in terms of the connection with the common good, because I'm kind of making a link here, and God being the common good, how do we, take someone like, the David Foster Wallace. This guy was not as far as I know, I don't think he was a believing Christian or anything, and yet he still recognized the same truth. how can we bridge a gap in our polarized culture, in our culture where no one seems to really be listening to one another? We're divided into tribes. How do we bridge a gap where we can all begin to sort of, let's like refocus on first principles? By the way, I have a feeling in a sense that, many people, even if they did kind of had bought into this, contemporary notion that maximizing human, individual autonomy and doing what I want is the ultimate good, even if it means, harming myself. Many of these people would actually agree, or at least see the reason, at least see the point of what we're talking about. And yet, we seem to be incapable in our contemporary culture of having a conversation like this, where we're not just screaming at one another. And that culture prevents us from rationally looking at first principles to say, hey, what is it that we actually agree on, and what do we disagree on? I just have the sense that if we were able to do that, then we would agree on a whole lot more than we think we could. And it seems to me that what we would agree on is that some return to some degree or another to the classical principles that we're talking about would be desirable. So how can we do that with those who don't believe in God? I mean, one of the interesting things about this conversation, because it's audio, it's somewhat difficult. I can imagine it might be difficult for the listeners to tell who's the Muslim, who's the Christian, and who's the Jewish scholar here, because of the extraordinary consensus. And yet that's precisely what our culture is lacking, is consensus. How can we broaden that consensus beyond Muslims, Jews, and Christians? And even that, by the way, getting Muslim Jews and Christians to understand that we do have a consensus is its own difficulty. How do we broaden that beyond the believers in the Abrahamic faith to those who are the nuns or those who are maybe atheists?
So, I mean, if I can take a
sure
first shot at that, and maybe, kind of respond to some of the points that were made before in the same context, and also introduce a little bit more particularity, and that'll be the theme. Right. So Judaism at kind of a base level differs from both the Christian tradition and the Muslim tradition, in that it's not in any kind of simple way, although I'll say, universalistic. Right? There's a complicated way in which it is universalistic, but it is kind of on a simple level, right? It believes that there's a divine law that's given to a particular people, right? That is not kind of that obviously is open to converts, but doesn't kind of pursue them. And this kind of distinction between kind of the particular and the universal is something that we see also duplicated in Maimonides' thought internal to the tradition, right? Where he thinks the commandments, the divine law, sets up a kind of realistic political system where most people can attain kind of temperance, as well as allowing extraordinary individuals to attain kind of human perfection. And it's that point that I want to come back to, this distinction between the common good on the one hand and private perfection on the other hand. Because I think that this is something, as I said, that comes out in Maimonides' intra-Jewish thought, but that's also expressed more broadly by the Jewish tradition, in that it sees certain things as good, and not just good, but obligatory for a particular community, while also coordinating that with the knowledge that there's a non-Jewish society that ought to be good and that has value as well. This is relevant, I think, to the questions that you raised, because this is something that I think we need to keep distinct within our contemporary political discussions. What we can unite around for the common good, on the one hand, and not our individual, but also kind of our communal visions of perfection on the other. Because it seems to me that many of our debates, both on the left and the right, follow from insistence on the imposition of visions of perfection, right, on the public sphere. And so distinguishing between these things, right? Not in a way that kind of leaves the public sphere to kind of the libertarian conception of kind of freedom that we were discussing, but kind of takes note of the fact that the public sphere will always involve kind of a plural, kind of a plurality of comprehensive conceptions of the good, to use kind of Rawls's language. Whereas visions of perfection are going to be pursued by communities, both secular and religious, and attained by individuals as well.
Yeah, if I can sort of piggyback on that, not to rouse Jewish or Muslim sensitivities with that word, but I think we have kind of two aspects to, let's say part of the larger question of how to have engagement with the current environment, the tribalistic ideological environment that we find ourselves in, that's very divisive. And I think the onus is on people of faith or theists. And I think oftentimes we don't realize it, but we've also been categorized into a tribe. And we may function like one sometimes. And I think there are members of, and I think we're aware of them, of each of our faith communities, who often sully that picture in the way that they engage with these issues. And I think we can take a page out of some of the, at least from my understanding of the Quranic perspective of some of the prophets, like David and Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and so forth, and Noah, where the common refrain of the people that they were part of their mission was, are you trying to, turn us away from our traditions and turn us away from that which we know, and to lead us astray from what we consider to be the good qualities that we know about. And I think that's a refrain we might hear also, like, that's so antiquated, that's very traditional, that's not progressive. So there's a lot of these kind of buzzwords that are going around. And I think if we, let's say, remove our religious cloak, in a sense, both literally and figuratively, and engage with these issues as are, and engage with people as people. It's amazing when you talk to people and they don't know your background, or they don't know your affiliation, and you just talk to them on a human level, how much you actually find in common. But everybody has their armor up, so to speak, with their tribal insignia, whether Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal, or all of the different labels that everyone is throwing around. But what really unites us is our common humanity. And I really do believe that people of faith are kind of the last stand in all of this. I mean, if we can't do something collectively to really get us out of what is increasingly looking like a quagmire, it's going to be difficult to find solutions. It needs someone who can see things universally, who can see the bigger picture, who can see beyond their own tribe. And we said the issue or the point of the common good. And all of these other groups, they're functioning like tribes. They're not even really thinking about the faith or it's like complete canceling of the adversary, which is something that is, I'm not going to say unprecedented, but I don't think, at least in my lifetime, I haven't seen it to this degree. You watch an old presidential debate between, let's say, the Republican primary or something like that, or between Carter and Reagan, and you see civility. I mean, you see actual discussion of issues, or Kennedy and Nixon. I mean, there's some pomp and circumstance to those things, but not like today. I mean, compare that to the Hillary Clinton Trump debates or Biden and Trump, and it's just kind of, it looks like a caricature of something that used to happen. And so I think, we have to have healthy doses of reality and to combat these things. And I think really on just a basic human level, and just, friendship and fellowship and kindness and caring. I don't think people are really going to listen to theologians intellectually debate, no matter how much that might be of some benefit for people like us. But I think really it's putting those virtue ethics into practice, rather than talking about them, actually practicing and living them, that I think we can see, hopefully, some good results. So thank you all for allowing me to participate. I kind of have to sign off now, and I hope we can do this again soon. And I look forward to the next opportunity. Inshallah.
Thank you, Dr. Sheikh Walead and Sheikh Yonatan Brafman and Dr. Matthew Levering. Ending the conversation now seems sort of like a crime. I think we could go for a couple hours at least, but thank you so much for your insight. And I hope that we can all champion Maimonides and Aquinas and Ghazali and others and make this our society a better one for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Goodbye.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.